Aye.
We're live.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the study session of the University City Council to order on January 24th at 5:30. Mr. Rose, do we have any or anyone changes to the regular agenda this evening? Hearing none. Mr. Rose.
Honorable Mayor and council members, this item asks that you receive a presentation. It's an update on the Annex and Trinity Building renovation projects and provide direction. Tonight we have Ms. Amanda Trumper with Trivers that will be presenting this item. Ms. Trumper.
So yeah, it's great to be in front of everyone again. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me know when everyone can see this.
We can see it.
I think we can see it. Yep.
Right. So tonight, I've been invited to share an update on our progress of schematic design. So as we've completed our schematic design documents in middle of December, and then had cost estimating performed to really check our budget from our prior conceptual studies from the space needs study. So this is our first chance inside of this scope with all of our development to test those numbers. So tonight is really just to kind of give you a nice overview of where we've kind of been from our early conceptual assumptions to where we are now. So kind of high level, this kind of, it's got a lot of text on the slide, but this summary is really just intended to show you some of the things that we've learned more about since the last time we provided an update to council. And those things being, connector building that requires a bit of restructuring. So we're going to review a bit of that's at the entry of the connector. So we'll review what that means and that scope. We'll also, one of the other things that we've imbued into the cost estimating, a little bit of additional scope clarification about trying to restore the third floor skylight at the annex. We also learned during our study that previously we thought we were going to have to needle in another egress stair. So we've got the historic stair at the annex. We needed definitely a new north stair to make the program work. We also thought we were going to have to put in a second new stair into the annex at the south side. Upon further code review, we've learned that we are able to meet all the egress requirements without that additional stair. So there's been a bit of scope removal, which created some efficiencies in the plan, which is kind of great news there. We also learned over the course of these studies, we've got structural engineers involved now, the whole consultant team is now chiming in. So we have a lot better defined scope for the removal of the stacks in the Trinity building. And then programmatically, things didn't really shift very much at all. One of the very small shifts that we learned about early on in our schematic design process with the different departments is that the courts functions all really wanted to be located together in the Trinity building. So we no longer have a one-stop for courts administrative activities in the one-stop at the entry, but we do have a finance counter in that space now instead of the municipal courts function. So all the courts functions will now happen solely within the Trinity building. It didn't really change the program, it just changed kind of who's going where in that one-stop space. So the number of transaction counters are the same. And then in this round, we've also priced the seismic retrofit scope for the annex as a separate number so that the city has visibility on where those costs are trending. Site improvements is another area where we have a lot more development. Our previous study was really kind of a pretty straightforward, almost graphic overlay of maximizing parking counts and things like that in the parking. We've learned a little bit more about best use for the site, including best location for some of the secure parking areas. So there were some adjustments to the site that move some things around, and I'll talk through it with what that means for numbers, but we also learned about, through our civil and landscape designers, some of the other requirements that are going to be required by MSD or some of the other construction and regrading that we're going to need to do on the site. Any questions before I move along? So for the connector entrance, is everybody seeing the same black screen I am? What is happening? Are you guys getting any disruption in the visuals?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure about that. I think we're back. Oh. Michael, I may need you to run back up for me. Okay, so the connector, we've looked at designing that new entry. We did a quick study when we did the fly-through video that I know we shared with council earlier this year. We've developed that even further. Some of that development is related to some of the structural condition that we've, through further assessment, there are portions of the connector that are actually in fairly poor shape. So we're restructuring a little bit of it to correct for those things, but it also gives us an opportunity to right size that connector, make those structural elements relate better to the annex itself, and really create kind of the right size of this new front entry to the City Hall campus. Like every time I move my mouse over there. Okay, I'm gonna try another thing. Sorry about that. That's always something. Okay, let's see. I've moved out of slideshow mode. Okay. All right, so the site plan as well. Oops. Sorry about the tech, guys. The site plan, just a quick overview. You'll see that this is a little different from the last time we presented this to this body. We have moved what was kind of planned north, so north is to the right on these plans. Most of the secure parking was actually to the north of the site, and as we learned further in our discussions and our more in-depth studies, that a better location for the secured parking was to be more immediately adjacent to the annex building. So this is the police vehicles, some limited amount of secure parking for city staff. And then, so this kind of reorients the site just a little bit. It keeps the public parking open and to the north and mostly adjacent to the Trinity building, where you have kind of, I think, your highest, attendee, like use case things happening both with council meetings and with works sessions. So we've kept that parking still very, very close to the Trinity. And then we've got the secured parking here in the middle. And rather than bisect and have two areas of secure parking, this consolidates it. As well as I noted before, we've got skylight restoration happening on the annex second floor, and then the restructuring of this addition. The totality of the addition is only about 1,400 square feet. It's not a large footprint, but there is a portion of the connector that kind of exists in about half of it that is being restructured to accommodate it and to correct for some not great existing conditions. So all of this is to say that, there's things I'm talking about, a little bit more here, a little bit less there. Overall, when we did the space needs study, our assumptions about the annex came in at about 15.6 million, the Trinity at 2.3, and site work at about 1.6. Into this next round, our cost estimating that was completed at the very beginning of January, based on a whole host of additional assumptions and studies. The annex cost actually came down by about 2.3 million, the 3.6. The Trinity assumptions went up by about 1.2 million, and the site work went up by about 1.3. The overall kind of changes, site work, as a percentage of a change in its cost assumptions increased the most, and we can have a more in-depth conversation about why, but I'm going to kind of outline the things that we saw kind of line by line in the cost estimate about what's up, what's down. The overall, I think, thing to report, though, is that our subtotal really only increased by about $250,000. And then when you take into account the seismic retrofit scope as kind of a below the line item as we're pricing it in this phase, our total project right now is coming in at 2.2 million, which represents just about a $700,000 increase from our prior assumptions. Some of these things, again, high level, the seismic retrofit allowance is now below the line. We also have mechanical allowances that were increased, money related to the sustainability goals that we've assigned to the project that weren't necessarily part of our initial assumptions. We've got electrical power allowances that are increased by further defining the COPS and DCOI requirements for police, as well as some of the site improvements that I mentioned earlier. And another factor that, that we've kept high at this stage in our cost estimating is escalation. Our prior study, which was done in November of 2020, assumed a certain amount of escalation. Usually, a year later, you'd see that escalation number trend down just because, you'd be closer to your date of construction. We've not done that. In fact, we've ticked it up just a little bit as a percentage, just to account for some of the current supply chain stuff that we see and to keep that, kind of keep those assumptions a little bit more protected. So I won't go too much into this slide. You've seen this, this summary before. We shared this in our summary of the space needs study. That study came into these selected projects for the Annex Trinity, and site work came in at 19.5 million. When we get to this project, we're at 19.8 plus the structural retrofit, which represents about a 3.6% increase over the previous. And what you'll note here is we've got a few more columns coming in as we start to divide the cost estimate a little bit differently. But the one thing that I was noting is that escalation before was at 5.5%. You might normally see that come down, but because of the current climate, we've kept that, just ticked it up just a smidge to be safe at 5.6. So to walk through kind of some of the line by line changes that happened with each of these buildings, what do the deltas represent? And so the overall decrease of our assumptions about the annex to the tune of about 2.3 million, most of which is represented by a very, very conservative number that we're carrying for the seismic retrofit. We were carrying about 2.7 million in costs related to that retrofit. And because we've brought on structural and we understand better the shear wall systems, we've analyzed the building, that number has come down considerably. So it's closer to 500,000. So that is one big assumption, that kind of a safety net assumption at that stage of just conceptual design. We've learned a lot more, and we feel like we're in better shape there. We are doing further geotechnical studies to confirm that that number is good. So we'll have more to report there, but that's the number that I think shows the most volatility, I think because of its most amount of unknown when we were in the conceptual phase. The exterior enclosure, not a big amount, came up by about 75,000, mostly related to better defining the scope for the exteriors, window replacements, things like that. Roofing, similar, just better defined assumptions based on those and the skylight restoration allowance. The interior construction and demolition came down by about 900,000, some of which is related, like I mentioned earlier, that stair that we no longer have to needle in. All these things are better defined as well. The conveying systems, which is the renovations to that elevator, remained unchanged. Those were good assumptions. The mechanical in this building, and you'll see between the two buildings, some of these mechanical electrical systems are a little blended because we are centralizing our mechanical and electrical plants between the two buildings. So some of this kind of goes to one and goes to the other, but it's just right now in our cost line items based on what's in what building. So what facilities, what part of the plant is where, but the mechanical went up by about 200,000, which isn't a lot, but the electrical did go up by about 1.8 million. And a lot of that is based on the COPS and DCOI requirements. And then our electrical and lighting and access controls are also much better defined for this phase. And then we've got some equipment that wasn't necessarily accounted for, and not because it was a miss, it's just because in this part of the assumptions, it starts to get, just more and more detailed. And so we've got a little bit more detailed knowledge of some of the equipment things. So we're talking about things like holding cells, things that are more off the shelf that in our cost estimators purview considers aid equipment. It's not things like furniture, fixtures, office furniture, those sorts of things are excluded still at this time. The scope of the Trinity, it trended up by about 1.2 million. The superstructure went up by about 105,000. You'll see from this section here, all of the stacks that we're removing from the building. So this being further defined both from a structural standpoint and the retrofits that are needed to do that, as well from an architectural standpoint, just the things that are impacted and other finishes that will need to be touched. are much better defined. We didn't have this section necessarily in conceptual design. So this I think describes pretty well kind of there's a lot that's coming out of the Trinity as relates to those interior stacks. The exterior enclosure went up about the same as the annex, and that's also related to better definition of the windows and what type of windows are going to go in for replacement. The roofing, similar, just better allowances assumed. Interior construction demolition essentially saw no change. I would say demolition didn't trend up, but we saw that the superstructure did, and that's again related to the stack removal. On the conveying systems, we have an elevator consultant on board now, so that initial assumption came down a little bit. The two stopped. We've got a remote machine room, so we've got a much better defined elevator for the new elevator for this building. So that assumption was able to come down a little bit. And then the mechanical, you'll see, came up by 435 and electrical 375. Again, some of that's code compliance, some of that's the shared plant. A lot of systems are going to be shared between the two. Actually, all the systems are shared between the two. Some are located in the Trinity mechanical room. That's this kind of pit that exists in the Trinity right now. And then again, better definition of electrical lighting and access controls. And then the site work, which, as I've said, just as a percentage of itself, saw the largest increase from previous. And so I'm prepared to have a more robust conversation if we want to. I've even got some slides in an appendix if we want to talk about the things that changed on the site, just to kind of give everybody a little bit more background. But the summary of that really is that the electrical went up by about 325,000. That's related to lighting and access controls being better defined, site lighting. We've got really, really good schematic design drawings that explain that scope in obviously much higher detail than our previous, more of a graphic related to how we organize the site. The site prep costs trended up to by about 215,000. That's related to the planning revisions as we talked about. So we've got a little bit more pavement demolition, a little bit more grading. And then the site improvements themselves, again, paving and landscaping, regrading, the MSD requirements. We've got some water treatment that has to happen as relates to BMPs. We've got a kind of a preliminary advice on how we are going to have to treat the soils and the water for this project. And then we've got a small add, not a large number, but we've also added a retaining wall for that generator, that's for police, for that new generator. And there were no changes to the assumptions for the site utilities costs. Any questions for me on any of this?
Amanda, I'm not sure that I can see who is asking a question the way we've got this set up. So we either have to keep going or we've got to change the format, or someone's just got to say their question. So is there more? I assume there's more graphics, or are we good?
There's a couple more. Yep, I can go ahead and finish. There's really just this last slide. So our next steps are to move into design development. Our design development will run us through the end of March. So that's really our next phase, January, February, March, are for us to add additional detail to our schematic design drawings. We plan to start to move through the approvals process with the city with this project. So preliminary site and building department review are going to start to come in. A historic preservation committee review, additional council updates as needed. I understand public engagement updates are happening through the website and meetings like this. And then, any others that for visibility, I think there's the Sustainability Commission, there's others. This is the time now to make sure that we've addressed each of those committees' concerns and given them updates on the scope of the project. And then just additional consulting that may or may not benefit the project coming up. Geotechnical investigations, those are actually being performed right now. You might see some drilling happening in the city site in the next few days, weather depending. That will help us validate our assumptions for the structural retrofit for the annex. There could be a need for some wayfinding scope, and we can talk about what those things are, I think, further down the line, just as far as making the campus easy to navigate. Furniture, fixtures, and equipment, other than the things that are very specific that we've already predefined with our specifications and base drawings, are another thing, like conference tables, chairs, stuff like that. That is right now excluded from the construction costs. Those are considered more soft costs. And then abatement scope, we keep that as just an agenda item for our team to make sure that any abatement is understood and communicated to the general contractor before construction activities begin. So besides that, those are kinds of things we're kind of tracking during DD, making sure that we're kind of keeping up with all the things that we need to do to keep everybody informed. We've got a lot of breakout sessions happening with each of the departments as we move forward, as we get into more and more detail. So our group that used to meet every other week is meeting almost weekly now, depending on who needs to come to some of these more specific style meetings. So that's all happening over the next 3 months. And then the overall schedule, we're set to complete construction documents by the end of July, with a bid period of a couple months during bidding and contractor selection, still with an anticipated construction start date of October of this year, and then with an estimated completion date of December of 2023. That date will certainly be better defined by the chosen general contractor. That's why we kind of always parenthesize that with estimated. And that's my update.
And then Amanda, are you ready? And Gregory, I assume we're ready for questions at this point in time from my colleagues.
Yeah, that's correct.
Is there a way, Amanda, can we move off this screen, or?
Can you stop sharing, Amanda?
And I have a couple of questions, but I'm happy to wait till the end. So who would like to begin? Stacy?
Thank you, Mayor Crowe. Appreciate the presentation. Three questions related to costs. Do we feel like, in understanding construction projects are always dynamic, and especially one of this scale, but do we feel like we are confident in this being the cost, barring something just completely unforeseen and unanticipated? Because we did see an increase. To your point, we were up in some places, down in others, but it is more expensive than was originally quoted.
Yeah, I think what we've done, and to your point, things are dynamic, and we're also learning more and developing more details. And what I failed to be more explicit about was our design contingency is still almost at $2 million. So that's really meant to cover the unknowns at this time. So between escalation and design contingency, we've got about 2.5 million in kind of that gray, part of trying to anticipate those sorts of things. So our design contingency only went down from 15% from conceptual to 12% in this phase, but it's still a pretty good size contingency.
Okay.
Let me just add on to what Amanda has indicated. I want to just be very transparent. The estimates that have been presented to you do not include furniture, fixtures, and other equipment. Some of those things are built into the project, but office furniture and those types of FF&Es, that's not included. That's something that I will likely recommend pay as you go. We'll need to discern, what equipment is still usable, and then what's not. And the chief and his staff will provide a lot of information, as well as Brooke and Catherine in the court staff.
Okay, and thank you. I was going to ask about that because I noted that was not a part of these cost estimates, so I appreciate you bringing that forward. In City Manager Rose, this may be a question for you. In terms of community engagement, that's a part of the process articulated by Trivers. What are we envisioning for that?
I think it really depends. A lot of it has to do with what happens with COVID. But I would say at the very least, probably we'll end up doing some presentations once we get further down the road and what the actual design is going to look like. And we'll continue to update the mayor and council where you're informed as well as the public through these updates.
Okay, but there is an idea of separate president. We know COVID will determine the format, but that's really what I was getting at. That there would be.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clay, I think as a part of the contract, we included at least a couple of presentations, and so we'll work with Traverse to make that happen. Likely, if it's still in a high positivity rate, that's probably going to be more of a Zoom,
Right.
and we'll have the opportunity once we've briefed you on what the status is to also do similar briefings to the public if you think that is that's needed.
And finally, speaking of community engagement, I know Green Practices, the Green Practices Commission has had questions about sustainable design and other elements of that sort. You may not be prepared to answer right now, but a thought of engaging them in some form or fashion as they've expressed interest. I think Director Alphasan can also attest to that fact as well.
I think if the mayor and council are interested in the Green Practice Commission's perspective, might be worthwhile to invite them to one of these presentations. We are on a very tight schedule, and anything that would slow that process down potentially makes the cost increase. Who would think that there would be 7% inflation right now? But I think if there is a desire by the council to hear their perspective on this type of project, then yeah, I would recommend maybe a joint meeting with them during one of these presentations. But that's something for you and your colleagues to decide.
Thank you.
I think Boyne had a question as well.
Thank you, Mayor Crowe. My question is open to any three, and that could be Ms. Amanda, City Manager Rose, and or Police Chief Hampton. And that is, if you could define or explain with the secure parking, and I know that my question is about with the number of officers that we have coming in, and I know that they come in shifts, but also how that works, where the officers will be assigned to park, where the city employees will be parking during the day, and sort of kind of, the maximum number, because we're talking about 66 or 64 secure parking. So I just kind of wanted to understand how that's going to work for city employees and, and the police.
Well, I'll first let Amanda just talk about the exact number of spaces that's being proposed, and then I'll let Chief Hampton address the issue of how he intends to have his employees park. So Amanda.
Thank you. So I know the parking count for the police very intimately because we have been able to hit the program requirement of the 65 plus or minus parking spaces for police and their program. And that is all wholly contained within the secure perimeter. The public parking has been, it's over 100, but it's been the remainder of the site holds the public parking. So that's everything to the north. As well, we've got 5 spots right in front of the new entry at the connector, which includes 2 accessible spaces for that kind of short-term city business that may happen during the day.
Excuse me. Good afternoon, Mayor, Honorable Mayor, and members of the council. Council Member Smothers, indeed. Can you hear me well?
Yep.
Okay. The secure parking, we have never had secure parking for the fleet vehicles for police, fleet vehicles themselves, like many of the other police jurisdictions in around us in St. Louis County and St. Charles County, they do secure those police vehicles. So specifically, we're chopping that up with Public Works, with the city manager, about the city officials parking, as well as city police-owned vehicles and city-owned vehicles themselves. The public parking areas I've already discussed with Amanda and her team that will be under surveillance 24/7, as well as the extra patrols that we provide for that. Right now, we're all parking in all just mixture of availability, other than the assigned parking spaces for the police cars near the temporary facilities. So specifically, the secure parking is something more to enhance prisoner operations, enhance transport, conveyance, and all of such when we're dealing, and specifically when we're going into the building, out of the building, over to the courts building itself. So that is why that is kind of preferred for a more secure, as well as within the accreditation process. It's also one of the standards that they would like to be achieved within that.
Okay.
Wayne, did that answer your question?
Sort of, kind of. I guess that does. And but so the spaces will also include the electrical vehicles. Is that correct?
I plan on doing that. Is correct. I have spoken to Sanan Absalon for securing those city inspector vehicles, those planning vehicles, whatever vehicles that the city owns. That's we're trying to incorporate that. If not in this space, then we will have that incorporated within the garage space as well.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
If I can just briefly follow up on Blaine's question, because I'm kind of along the same lines. When I looked at the parking, I'm trying to discern. I get all of the secure parking, and I guess the first question, since most all of us visited Creve Coeur and we visited Clayton, do both of those have secure parking for their police staff? I assume they do, because they're both pretty new structures. Is that a fair statement, Chief? Do you know?
I would take those two names, and I would guarantee you that Florissant and Bridgeton does. So specifically Clayton and Creve Coeur, I could not speak on specifics of their secure parking availability, especially Clayton at this point, because I know that was more of a renovation model. A lot of their vehicles are parked inside of a parking garage, so I don't know if that is considered secure or not for them. Speaking of which, I can say it is, because there's a swipe card access that you have to get inside to get to the parking garage for the Clayton vehicles themselves. So yes, that is secured as well.
And then the next one is just more of it looks to me like, if again, maybe I just don't read the schematics well. If you're a person wanting to come to City Hall, not to the police station, looks to me like you're basically telling them to park in the North 40 and walk past the police station, then up to City Hall, versus where they park right now, which is 20 feet from the front door or 50 feet from the basement door. Or am I misreading this?
Amanda, could you go back to that slide that shows City Hall, the location in the parking?
Yeah, and Honorable Mayor, this is still in daily talks and weekly talks that we're having with the Trivers and HOK groups. But I can tell you right now, what's not being addressed is the parking currently on Sergeant Mike King Drive or Trinity themselves. So specifically, the public parking access is to provide a much larger quantity for that purpose.
Yeah, and I see that. I'm just trying to figure out, though, if you're the public and you're parking on Mike King Drive, you've got a pretty long way to walk into the front door of City Hall, because the door's on the complete other side. That's all I'm trying to figure out, is making sure that we are both being respectful of the need for secure parking and for people coming in and out of the court building and the police building, but also those people who will just be doing business with City Hall. And I'm just trying to figure out where, and I, with COVID, I think we're learning that many people can do this, hopefully from their homes, but where do they park?
I'll let Amanda address a little bit of that. As far as on the west side of the building is still the parking like it currently is, I guess, in the street area of So that is still accessible from that area as well. Now, Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, that trench right there where you have your arrow at right there, can you describe that area for the mayor?
Those are the 5 spaces that I think I was describing earlier that have the accessible space and we're really considering the short-term parking. If you intend to be at the city all day for business, staff otherwise would be using, like you said, the North 40. But the kind of daily use, 30 minutes to an hour, kind of, come in, come out.
Right.
5 spots located right adjacent to the main entry. As you stated, Chief, there's also lots of parking along Mike King Drive, street parking, and otherwise along this drive. But yes, to your point, most of the public parking is located in this section. What we learned from our conceptual study when we did the public engagement about parking, the highest volume of people on site for this program will most likely be for council meetings, at least at any one time, for council meetings and for courts. So part of the impetus to try to put as much parking as possible toward the Trinity is to accommodate that building's kind of largest volume of people at any given time, post-COVID assumptions kind of notwithstanding.
And then where you were back with the 5 small spots on that right there, then John Q. Public walks in the new restructure for entry addition, and that takes him or her into City Hall.
This is our new accessible entry into City Hall.
But City Hall, you can go left into City Hall or right into the police station. Am I correct or not?
That's 100%.
Okay. And then the final question I have, and Gregory, I don't know whether whether you or the chief want to answer, but I think all of my colleagues, at least I think when we've all had our conversations, would like to know the depth and the breadth of the involvement of the police force in meeting with either Amanda or other people so that we are making sure that this building is being designed in a way that is meeting their needs. And Amanda, I think you can take that down if it helps maybe for us to see each other again, if that's possible.
Well, I will defer to Chief to respond to it. We have a number of officers that are participating in the design phase of it. But I'll let Chief share with you who his designees are for this project.
Yes, sir. I actually have a member of every bureau here in the police department that meets on a regular, continual basis with the members of Amanda's team and other vendors that they work with. We're now having breakout sessions, which are the breakout meetings for the individual parts of the area. Specifically, this past week, we normally meet every other week, every other Thursday, in a very formal manner. I mean, sometimes those meetings go as long as 2 hours. So specifically, every bureau in the police department has a say so and has more informal information of this project, and it has their input in that.
Honorable Mayor and council members, we wanted to ensure that police participated within the design phase. I'm not a police officer. And so where I understand it from a process perspective, kind of what they should be doing, they're the people that are doing it day in and day out. And so to get their input and thoughts regarding what's a design that's really going to function well for them, that's something that is invaluable. Same thing for the courts. They're heavily involved in design for the court, which will also be court / council chambers. But to get that expertise and how they operate throughout the day is just an invaluable time.
My other colleagues, questions? Alita.
Yeah, I just had a question about, I was going to ask what aspects that you'll be covering when you give your review to the Historic Preservation Commission.
That commission is, they're great. I mean, Trivers is a highly historic office as a practice. So we're looking forward to sharing with them, things like window details. restoration things that we're doing to interior plaster. Also reassuring them of what we're not doing to the building, which is, I think, a lot of how those meetings go, right? So we're not doing additions that are incompatible. We are not, removing any portions of these structures that are contributing to their significance. It's really, we're approaching this in a preservation and a restoration type of capacity. And so that meeting is really just to kind of outline the things that we're doing that treat these buildings with utmost respect.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Thank you, Mayor Crow. I kind of want to circle back to Amanda, what you talked about and referenced earlier with abatement. This obviously is one of the oldest buildings in U City. From a health and safety perspective, I think we all know that there's been abatement done on the building already. Through the process, and I think there is concern among some people and perhaps some people who were certainly in the building for many years. As a renovation moves forward, what is the process if through demolition you come across anything that needs abatement? And then also the building, I imagine, probably has a hodgepodge of different existing conditions, probably many of which are HVAC related. Is this a complete tear out, start over from the beginning type of a plan?
So the second question is easiest to answer, so I'll start there. Yes, we are replacing all systems 100%, all plumbing, piping, all mechanical ducting, all electrical wiring, everything is going to be 100% new. The only part that I might say we're reusing, there is a tunnel that connects the Trinity to the annex that we're reusing a route for that. That's all subsurface. It's actually below the parking lot, connecting the two. And so we're utilizing that path. So I would say we're reutilizing that path as a piece of infrastructure, but we're not reusing any actual systems. So it's all going to be brand new. And to that point, it's all going to meet the enhanced energy code of U City as well. So those are the goals there. As far as abatement goes, you're right. There's so much testing we can do and assessing we can do and assumptions that we can make. Considering that almost all of this is complete, removal for renovation. If a wall went in over a floor that we weren't able to test and pre-inspect, when that wall comes out and it exposes something, then that's kind of the due course of construction. So that will really be for the GC to manage with the abatement contractor. To make sure that when those things are discovered, I mean, usually when things like that are discovered, the phone call is made, the abatement comes out and and abates, they demobilize and everybody can come back to the job site. And that's very common in projects like this. I think we'll be looking for general contractor partners that are very familiar with buildings like this so that they're also making sure to do this in a safe manner, both for the workforce that's in the construction side as well to make sure that everything is absolutely taken care of. A lot of abatement overlaps with demo, as you kind of noted, those things are absolutely related. And so a lot of these things that might be of concerning content will be a part of removal anyway. I think to your point though, yeah, we'll do everything we can with what we can see. And then as things reveal other things, it kind of becomes a rolling thing at the beginning part of construction. With a big renovation like this, we're not going to see surprises later in the construction phases. But we would be asking for expectations about days like that to be built into a schedule.
Thank you. And I think to the mayor's point, I think that aspect of this, I think, is incredibly important to convey to all of the folks that have and will be working in that building. I had a couple of other questions. One is sort of infrastructure related, and that is, we talked about the electric vehicles that we currently have. Is there any sort of thinking, at least at this stage, in terms of, I'm somebody who believes that the technology is going to get to the point where we're going to have fleets of police vehicles that are all electric, and planning for that infrastructure in the case that that happens. A second question is relative to the elevator in the Trinity building. I think accessibility is something that is very important given the current location of the council chambers and former courts. Is that to be one elevator or two elevators? And I know that the existing front staircase is quite large. Is there going to be an ADA redundancy, like a chairlift, that if there's one elevator and it goes down, there's access and egress for anybody with those needs?
To answer your question about planning for the future, related to electrical vehicles or things like that, especially as relates to the site, as I understand it, our drawings right now include conduit and wiring that could be tapped into for future parking spaces. While we may not provide them on day one, we're trying to provide an infrastructure that can allow that to be expanded. Related to the elevator at the Trinity and accessibility, if you recall, we're moving kind of the front door from the west to the east. So that's where the new elevator will go. That's where a new monumental stair will go. We're actually that older, that beautiful, but, kind of stair that happens at the former main entry is really going to be mostly an egress only corridor. We've not talked about creating redundancy with the chairlift, but we could. There could be an opportunity to do it in there, or potentially even with the large monumental stair that's going to kind of wrap the new elevator core. I would also say that new elevators don't tend to go down. So I know that's not a promise. We're not trying to create a redundancy in elevators themselves for sure. But I would hope that there would be much greater consistency with a brand new elevator. But if there's concerns that we need a second place in which to accommodate those people, we can absolutely look at that.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Ms. Trumper or the chief or Mr. Rose?
I just have one.
Okay.
There was a question that I saw recently about the public parking spaces, and should a hotel or when a hotel is to go up on Kingsland, those spaces would not be shared parking. Is that correct?
Well, there's certainly no intention to share parking with them at this point. If it becomes apparent that we have more parking than what we need, then that's a possibility. But all of those issues would come to the council for a thorough discussion and then a decision. But at this time, no, there's no intention to have any shared parking.
Thank you.
Anything else on this topic for the council this evening? I don't see anyone else raising their hands. And so with that, Amanda, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure you'll be hearing through Gregory again with if there are any more questions and other concerns from our colleagues or from those we represent. Chief, thank you for joining us as well. With that, we will adjourn the study session and begin in about 10 minutes for the city council meeting.